Hello, do you like cotton candy? When it's nice and fluffy and fresh, and like going to a carnival or something where they make it and they stir it around in that big metal vat, and then you pull it off and eat it, or maybe you do that at the movies or something. Well, carnivals often have that kind of food, and there is a famous huge fair that's in Dallas, Texas, at Fair Park, that is known as the Texas State Fair, and it's huge. It has a huge carnival, thousands and thousands of rides, and it has a livestock exhibit, and it has a car exhibit and bands playing and all sorts of fun things to see. And probably most important of all, it has become famous for big techs. And he'd stand out in the fair and go, "Howdy, partner." The other thing that it has become famous for is it has the world's biggest Ferris wheel. Well, all of those things are going to figure in our first story. And this one is by a woman named Dottie Enderle, and it's called The Great Cotton Candy Catastrophe. Now, it's hard to imagine a catastrophe with cotton candy, but that's what the book's name. So listen to it and see if it doesn't fit in as a Texas tall tale. Zach finally got his day to go to State Fair, and he walked in, and the first thing he headed for was no, not the arcade games, no, not going down the midway and riding several rides. He went straight to find some food. Now, not a hot dog or a fried Twinkie. Yeah, they have fried Twinkies. He went for cotton candy, and he walked up to Mrs. Pearl Jackson's cotton candy, and he said, "One, please." And he plopped his money on the counter, and she began to stir a huge cotton candy thing for him. She handed it across the aisle to Zach, and he took it and said, "Thanks very much." And he turned and left, holding it up high. Well, she was amazed when Mrs. Pearl Jackson looked up and saw that the cotton candy was trailing still. It hadn't disconnected from the big vat. So she quickly turned the machine off. Meanwhile, Zach is walking down the midway, looking for things to do, trailing a huge, sticky, icky strand of cotton candy all the way back to Mrs. Pearl Jackson's cotton candy booth. And as he walks through the arcade where you throw balls to knock down milk cartons, he's trailing it all over that. And he doesn't know because it's all behind him. When he walks past the place where you throw darts to get prizes, he didn't want to spend his money on that, but those darts got covered in the cotton candy. Even all of those stuffed animals that you could win at the park, covered in that pink, sticky, gooey part. Then he walked over toward the rides, and he saw the first ride, and it reminded him of something that he used to do when he was a kid, and he hopped on the merry-go-round. And as he went around and around and around, well, you fourth graders figured it out, he's trailing cotton candy behind him the whole way, and it wraps itself around and around. And Zach never noticed. The ride was over, and he got off, and he kept on walking. He came to the livestock exhibit, and he went in, still trailing that cotton candy, because Mrs. Pearl Jackson had turned off the machine, but it was still putting out more cotton candy. And soon that cotton candy got all over the sheep. They had pink wool, not their pretty other beige wool. They had all of the longhorn steers, got it caught on their horns. It was terrible. Still, Zach didn't know anything, and he kept on walking kept on walking. He came by Big Tex and kind of thought it was funny as he would say in his big sonorous voice, "Hi there, Texans. Welcome to the State Fair." And he kind of chuckled at it. But behind him, Big Tex was wearing a pink tutu. So he got onto the Ferris wheel. And, you know, it's the biggest Ferris wheel in the whole world. Got strapped in, and he started going up, trailing that cotton candy the whole way up. And when he got to the very top, it stopped. It seems the cotton candy had gotten stuck in the machinery. And as he swayed up there in his little Ferris wheel car, he began to see what a catastrophe had occurred. There was pink floss everywhere. Like I said, Tex had on a pink tutu. There was stuff all over the arcade. There were things beginning to wrap around the Cotton Bowl, the big football stadium. It was everywhere. People were covered with the pink stuff, trying to fight it off, but there was so much sticky stuff. Zach had an idea. He hollered out, "Come on, get me down, get me down." The two men who were brave enough to go into that pink flossy mess finally could pull a lever and get the Ferris wheel going again, and he came back down and they let him out. Well, as Zach walked, he began to gather the big wads of stuff, and he gathered and he gathered and he gathered around his cone, and when he couldn't put any more on the cone, he began to hold it up, and it got bigger and bigger, and he traced his way back through the livestock exhibit, back through the arcade, back by the merry-go-round, back past all the food stands, and he headed with this huge, let me mention, huge ball of cotton candy, and went into the cotton bowl, and he began to stuff it in there. Just then he called, "Call the fire department, call the fire department." Well, they had already come because everybody had called in about an emergency. They were right there, and they said, "What do you want us to do?" He said, "Spray that cotton candy down with your water." And soon they began to do that, and the cotton candy soon melted down to that sticky pink juice, sugar water, and the cotton candy catastrophe was over. Well, when he got himself cleaned up, he decided, well, I'm going to go ride my favorite ride, the roller coaster. And he walked back across the park, and he thought, you know, I'm kind of hungry. Well, the cotton candy booth, of course, was closed. And as people watched Zach moving along, kind of fearful for what he might do, they saw him. Oh no, it couldn't happen again. Could it? Yeah, could it? He was heading toward this taffy stand. And that is the story of the cotton candy catastrophe by Dottie Inverley. Thank you so much. You're probably wondering, having gotten used to the tall tales we told about Hercules last year, why I'm talking about Texas. Because that is your curriculum this year, especially in your social studies class. So that's the kind of stories we're going to hear all year. By the way, here's a little joke for you. Actually, it's a kind of a math thing, so you have to think about this logically. A man rode up on his horse on Friday. This is back in the Old West. And he left 3 days later on Friday. Now, how did that happen? Oh, I hope some wheels are turning back there. Well, how did that happen? His horse was named Friday. I hope you figured that one out. Speaking of tall tales and real things, I want to tell you about Ima. Ima lived in 1892. She was turning 10 years old out, and she lived on her father's ranch out in West Columbia, Texas. Now, her father was a big, important man in the state, and everybody kind of listened to him. And he told her one day, Ima, you should not brag. A lady knows her own worth, and she doesn't have to brag. Other people will just notice it. Well, she listened to him because most people in the state listened to her father, but she still kind of brags sometimes. Anyway, it was the morning of her 10th birthday. I bet a lot of you are 10 now. And she got up and her father said, come on, Ima, we're going downtown. We have to meet the train. Well, she couldn't imagine why they were meeting the train, and she kept begging him all that walk down there. Daddy, why do we have to go see the train? Daddy finally turned to her and said, if you must know, girl, that's where your birthday present is. It's coming in on this morning's train. Well, I thought, oh, that sounds great. What could come in on a train, though? She noticed Daddy had brought a lot of his ranch hands along, and there was quite a crowd gathered around the train station. And the train stopped, and people got off, and they began to unload some of the boxcars. And then, the very last boxcar, someone shoved a yellow ramp up to that boxcar and opened the doors. And when those doors opened, there was this loud hiss, and out stepped a huge 6-foot bird, an ostrich. Daddy patted Ima and said, that's your birthday present. I bought you your very own ostrich. She ran toward the boxcar. Oh, Daddy, I love it. But just then, the bird saw all those people around, let out a mighty wah, and went running down the ramp and down the dusty street. Her dad called for all the ranch hands to go capture it, and some of them tried to run, but it was going much too fast. Ostriches can travel up to 80 miles an hour. And so some got on their horses, and they went, and finally they lassoed that long neck and brought him back. And all the time that ostrich was squealing and making all sorts of noise. And he brought him to Ima, and she said, oh, Daddy, I love him. His name is Aussie, and I'm going to learn to ride him. Well, her father said, well, I wonder what Will and Tom, your brothers, will say about that. And she said, just watch me, just watch me. So when they got back home to the ranch, Will and Tom came running up to see what in the world that Ima had gotten for her birthday. And when they saw the ostrich, well, you know, they are kind of funny birds with those big feet and that long neck and that huge beak. And they started laughing and said, that's the ugliest turkey I've ever did see. Gobble, 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 said Tom. And she said, you just wait, boys. I'm going to learn to ride, Aussie, and I'll race you someday. Because they own beautiful quarter horses. They said, you do that, Ima. Well, the next morning, she got up real early because she had to back up her bragging. The ranch hands had brought Aussie into a corral, and she climbed up on the edge of it, and they brought the bird over there, and it was mad, and it was hissing at everybody and throwing its weight around. And somebody got a saddle on Aussie, and Ima stepped off onto that saddle, and she said, okay, boys, let go. And whoa! Aussie just started screaming around, running around the corral, and then it busted through the gate and kept on running, and she kept going, whoa, and she'd slip off, and she climbed back on, and she finally got it directed back into the corral, and the ranch hands grabbed the bird by feathers, by rope, by halter, and with a mighty throw of its huge back, Aussie bucked off Ima. Ima got up and dusted herself off and said, "Let's try it again, boys." Well, her father was standing outside the corral just chuckling, thinking, you know, that girl has mettle. M-E-T-T-L-E. And it means like strength, like confidence. And he said, I don't know. Well, over the period of several days, after getting bucked off numerous times and nipped by that strong ostrich beak, she began to ride him. Now, it didn't happen in a straight line. Sometimes she had to ride him in a circle until she could begin to steer him back. She kept riding him for about a week, and then it was time to face her brother, Will and Tom. Will and Tom, as I mentioned, had beautiful quarter horses. One was a beautiful chestnut brown, the other was black as night. And they were just wonderful, fast horses. The morning of the event came and all the people in town had come to watch to the ranch the race. The race would go down about a half a mile, turn a big corner, come down another mile, turn another big corner, and back. Well, they were all out there, and then with this huge squawk and bucking and feathers flying, Ima came out of the barn on top of her ostrich. She got up next to the boys and said, I'm ready. And Will looked at her and said, gobble, gobble. And she said, just watch. Well, Papa sounded the starting gun, and the two horses raced off down that half-mile track to the turn. Meanwhile, Aussie was going around in circles, and squawking as hard as it could. The people in the stands were laughing. I said, I'm going to get hold of this bird. And she got him going into a straight direction. Now, the horses were way ahead of her, with Tom's even further out than Will's. And she ran and she ran and she ran, and at the corner, she caught up with Will. And as she neared him on the backstretch, she looked over at him as she was riding and said, gobble, gobble. And then she ran on. Well, by now, Tom's horse was way down that backstretch. And she said, come on, Aussie, get that, get that. And he began to run at full speed, just running and running and running, eating the dust that was flying from that horse's hoofs. But it ran and ran and ran. And as they came around the last corner, she was just within a couple of yards of Tom's horse. And as they entered the home stretch, she ran and ran and ran. And just as they had a few yards left to go, Aussie pulled up even with Tom's horse and passed him by a foot. Ima won the race. Ima won the race. She was so thrilled. The crowd went crazy with excitement over an ostrich beating a horse, a quarter horse. And they were just so thrilled with that. When she got down and got all of her congratulations from the crowd, including her brothers who shook her hand, Papa hugged her tight and said, Ima, you are a girl with mettle, and I'll brag to anybody about that. Well, she was indeed a girl with a lot of mettle. And as I said, her name was Ima. Now look at and she was a real person. She went on to live till she was in her 80s. And she traveled all over the world and became a philanthropist, which means she donated to charities a lot. And her father was very famous because his last name was Hogg, And he, at the time when she got her bird, was the governor, and he was Governor Hogg. But people always thought his daughter's name, Ima Hogg, was a little funny, and so they remembered his one-term governorship well because of that. Now, there was always a myth that Ima had a sister, and her name was Ima Hogg, but her sister's name was Ur-a-Hogg. But that's not true. There really wasn't a Ur-a-Hogg. But let me end today by telling you one more kind of logical brain teaser. This is back in the Old West in Texas. And a huge cowboy rode into town kind of slowly on a beautiful horse. And he dismounted, and he was tall. He was 6'3", and in those days, men weren't that tall. And he dusted off his clothes from the trail ride, and he pushed right into the saloon and bellied up to the bar and said, "Give me a sarsaparilla." Well, all the guys thought that was kind of funny, and they came up and tried to hit him on the back, and he'd flinch and say, "You better leave me alone. You better leave me alone." And they could see by the size of his hands and his mean demeanor that he meant business. Well, the guy thought that since they couldn't pick on the cowboy, they'd go out and pick on his horse. So they did. They took the saddle off and they painted it a green color. Now later, when the huge cowboy walked out and saw his horse with the saddle on the ground and painted green, he just carefully began to wipe off that green powder and re-saddled the horse, tied it up on the hitching post, and went back in. And he burst open the saloon doors and said, "Now I want you to tell me who did that, because I don't want to do what I had to do in that last town when I had my horse stolen." Well, everybody looked around and kind of laughed. He said, "No, I mean it. I want you to tell me who painted my horse green and who took his saddle, because I don't want to do what I had to do in that last town to someone who messed with my horse." Everybody grew very quiet, and he walked around the whole saloon, and people waited an hour. It was deadly quiet. And he said, "Who's going to tell me who did that? Because I don't want to do what I had to do in that last town that I was in." Everybody kept looking down because they knew the bad bully that lived in town had messed with his horse. Another hour went by, and he said, "Nobody leaves till I know what happened to my horse, because I don't want to do what I had to do in that last town." And everybody kind of kept looking at each other thinking, "Oh man, we've got a gunslinger in our midst." And they all stayed in there till finally the bartender leaned over and said, "Carson and his men did that." Well, the guy turned around, he walked over to Carson, picked him up by his collar and said, "Don't you ever do that again. You understand?" And the guy was going, yeah. And he put him back down on the ground and said, "Bartender, how much I owe you?" Bartender said, Nothing, sir. You can just mosey on. And the cowboy turned to leave, and he said, Sir, can I ask you one question?" He said, "Well, sure. What do you want to ask?" He said, "What'd you do to guys in that last town? What happened in that last town?" He said, "Well, I walked home." Huh? You've heard my stories and my corny jokes, and now they are yours to tell. Hope you have a great week, And I will see you very soon in the month of October. Thank you for letting me tell. There, you've heard them and you've listened well. Maybe you can tell the story of Ima and the great ostrich race, or the story of the giant cotton candy catastrophe. Thank you. Goodbye.